Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome all to this webinar where we are discussing the new climate risk dashboard updates too. So just very briefly, my name is Aisha Tandon, and I am the science journalist at Carbon Brief, which is a UK-based climate journalism and analysis group. And I'm going to be moderating the panel today. I think we have a really fantastic set of speakers today who I will introduce you to in just a moment. Just to give you a bit of an update about what we're going to be talking about today in case you weren't sure. So we are going to be looking at the climate risk dashboard. This is a web tool that allows users to explore the impacts of climate change at the country and the city level and the different emissions scenarios. So for example, you can ask the tool how the world would look under current policies in 2030, 2050, 2100, under current emissions scenarios, and you can compare that, for example, to a world of 1.5 degrees C warming. And so interrogating this tool will allow you to find out how much average global temperatures need to be constrained to avoid specific impacts. Now, excitingly, the tool now has some new indicators added on fire risk, glacier loss, biodiversity loss, and on labour productivity loss. And so we're going to hear today from some scientists from the Provide projects and also some external experts and stakeholders. So I'd like to introduce some of the brilliant panelists who will be speaking today, who hopefully you can all see on your screens. So we're going to start with Dr. Karl Friedrich Schlossner, who is the Provide project lead, who's going to introduce the Provide project. We will then hand over to Dr. Quentin Lejeune, who's a senior scientist at Climate Analytics. He's going to explain a little bit more about the dashboard, give us a bit of a demo, show us a bit more sort of in action how this tool actually works. And we'll then hand over to Mariam Saleh Khan, who's a research scientist in weather and climate services, who's going to highlight a bit more of a specific case study looking at Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan. And then afterwards, going to get some reactions from some other stakeholders as well, Pam Pearson and David Cullen, who I will introduce in more detail when they come up. But for now, I would like to hand over to Karl to talk a bit more about the Provide project.
Thank you very much, Ayesha, and also a very good day from my side. It's a pleasure to see so many people here online and to have this fantastic panel joining us today. My name is Karl Schleusner. I'm the lead coordinator of the Provide project, which is, next slide please, is a project under the Horizon 2020 program of the European Union with 17 partners that's been going on for almost 3 years now. And we are very proud to say that we have advanced some of the key scientific questions around the Paris Agreement, risks of overshooting the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement, including asking ourselves what does it imply for climate impacts, their reversibility or irreversibility, but also going all the way to explore the adaptation implications on the ground in urban environments. One of the key products of the project is the Provide Climate Risk Dashboard, and you'll find the link to it on this slide, as well as under the QR code. I'm sure many of you have found the link already and you're actively exploring it. We are definitely very, very excited about having this tool online, and we'll talk a little bit more about its functionalities and the opportunities and different dimensions that you can explore with it in this event today. Next slide, please. But why are we exploring questions of climate overshoot? I mean, I think most of you have seen graphs like this one. We are this year and the ongoing El Niño and high sea surface temperatures that we are seeing across the globe provide us a stark reminder that we are way too close for comfort when it comes to the 1.5 degree limit of the Paris Agreement. In fact, last year has come in at around 1.4 degrees of annual warming, and our best estimate for the human-made component to it is around 1.3 degrees of warming. So we are unfortunately inching ever closer to the 1.5 degree limit of the Paris Agreement, making an overshoot, so at least temporary exceedance of that level. And this is how we understand the overshoot in this context here. A very distinct possibility, which we need to understand scientifically, but also understand what it means for climate action. Next slide, please. In order to do that, we are exploring a multitude of possible climate futures. It's very important to stress that an overshoot, so a temporary exceedance of a level and then returning back below again, is not another way to achieve the same climate outcome. There are a lot of consequences from that in different components of the climate system that we have explored under the project. And there are also a lot of different futures considering both the societal uncertainties, but also the physical uncertainties of a potential temperature reversibility by, for example, drawing on large-scale negative emissions. So we are focusing on a wide range of different scenarios that achieve net zero CO2 and then go beyond, therefore achieving a long-term temperature decline after a peak. And we are exploring those, and you can do so too on our dashboard. Next slide, please. All the things that you can explore in the dashboard actually cover a wide range of different physical climate impacts from the terrestrial, marine, and cryosphere space. So from basically exploring risks to global glacier loss, marine heat waves, other terrestrial biodiversity impacts in terms of local risk of species extinction, but also climate extreme indicators such as fire weather or heat stress indicators can be explored. And what we have developed under the Provide project, and you can also find this for the most of the indicators on the dashboard, is an approach that helps you to understand what is unavoidable due to insufficient emission reductions today in terms of the risk for a certain climate impact emerging, what is still avoidable by climate mitigation and what might be irreversible in the future. One example that I shown here on the slide is the risk from changes in species at risk from local extinction in Brazil, certainly one of the countries with which is a hotspot for global biodiversity. And you do see that the risk of losing, in this case, 50% of all species in the country of Brazil can still be largely mitigated, fortunately, but for other countries and others, this looks a little bit different. Next slide, please. But we don't stop at the physical hazard level. We are going all the way to exploring what it implies for adaptation, including in particular in the context on high resolution urban climate projections that we provide for 140 cities worldwide on the dashboard. And then for a number of case studies, we have explored urban adaptation storylines with urban planners, practitioners on the ground in the co-development approach. And my colleague, Dr. Mariam Salikan, will illustrate this in the example of our case study of the city of Islamabad in Pakistan today. Next slide, please. Another functionality that we have explored is what we call the reversal of the impact chain. So what you classically know from the way we provide physical climate risks is that we have a range of different climate scenarios and then basically an opening cone for different resulting impacts emerging over time. Next slide, please. And what we are doing or have explored is a reversal of that. So you start with a local risk threshold that is relevant in your context. For example, an urban heat stress level that would result in far-reaching health implications. And you can explore the risk of this threshold being exceeded over time, but also for different emission scenarios, thereby providing or assessing actionable climate information directly from the dashboard. And what do I mean by that? Next slide, please. We can illustrate this when we think about not just overshooting or exceeding global temperature thresholds of the Paris Agreement, but also all the way to the local level, for example, limits to individual adaptation actions. This is a very illustrative example, but based on the underlying data from the dashboard of different measures of urban adaptation. For example, planting new tree species at the top, improving water management for existing tree species in the middle, or transformational changes to the urban design. And all of these come with specific characteristics. So for example, if you plant new trees in an urban environment, they may be very effective in terms of the heat stress adaptation measure, but only if the trees have grown big enough. So there is a planning or an implementation time in the beginning. And we need to appreciate that these trees will still be affected by climate risks, for example, heat waves and droughts. So with ongoing climate change, there might be a limit to this, to these trees surviving under climate change and providing this ecosystem service. So we also need to consider that there's a limit to the effectiveness of that measure. And now if we did this for a mean or best estimate control, you see basically in our illustrative example, several of these options would provide you with different ways of tackling and adapting to increased heat in urban environments. But if you now were more risk averse and you would look for higher levels of climate risks, for example, a 5% threshold, this is how the timeline of your effectiveness of adaptation actions would change. So we need to expect risks basically in the high-end warming outcomes emerging up to decades earlier than in our best estimate. And when we plan adaptation actions, when we plan for climate resilient development, we need to consider such high-risk outcomes and the potential limits that may be crossed under them very carefully to avoid maladaptation and the sense of false security in a rapidly changing world around us, as we're all experiencing the climate risks right now, wherever we are firsthand. And with that, and how you can use that even further, I hand over to my colleague, Dr. Quentin Lejeune, who's been the lead developer of the Provide Climate Dashboard and will give you a guided tour through the tool.
Thank you very much, Carl. And hi, everyone, from my side. So I'm Quentin Lejeune. I work at Climate Analytics as a senior scientist, and I've been indeed leading the development of the Provide Climate Risk Dashboard. Today, I'm going to give you a tour of the web tool and focusing on the additions that we made to this version 2. So I'm going to share my screen now and start this live tour. Can you actually see my screen now? I just maybe a quick thumbs up or something like this would be helpful. Perfect. Then, yeah, so this is the Provide Climate Risk Dashboard landing page. And how I would describe the Provide Climate Risk Dashboard, it's first, I would say, a database on which you can explore, you can visualize, and you can also download information on global to local climate impacts. And it covers indicators for different, what we call geography types. So you have countries in there, you have cities, and for various sectors, such as biodiversity or glaciers, for example. So we're on the landing page of a tool, and it contains descriptions and links to different parts of the tools. You recognize here some graphs that Carl was showing. You also have at the bottom of the page a tutorial video explaining how to use the tool. The main page to access projections of future climate impacts is actually called the Explore page. And on this one, you have two user modes which are available. You have future impacts and avoiding future impacts. We'll start with this one. And on this one, you can explore how different levels of climate action will lead to different climate impacts. And this is where, in the new version of the tool, we have added information on how future climate change may affect glaciers, biodiversity, urban heat impacts on people, or fire risk and drought, for example. So, for example, we can try to find the answer to this question: what proportion of species living in Brazil, to follow up on Carl's example, would be threatened by climate change in the 21st century, depending on the trajectory of global greenhouse gas emissions. And to do that, so we first need to select Brazil from this drop-down menu called Geography. So here, let's select countries, and then let's select Brazil from the list. Right, and once this is done, we need to select an impact indicator among those offered for this country. There is currently only one indicator available for the biodiversity sector. We plan to add more later. This indicator is the proportion of species at risk from a local extinction. So let's select it. You can also check the exact definition of this indicator by hovering over its name. And you then need to select the global emission scenarios for which you would like to explore climate impacts over time. You can select 1 to 3 emission scenarios from this button here on the left. When clicking on it, you see a window popping up that allows you to select from a list of scenarios. For example, the scenario 2020 climate policies, which is already selected. It assumes no further climate action than the policies that were implemented in 2020. So on the right-hand side of that pop-up window, you can read a bit more information on each of the scenarios available on the list, including how global warming is projected to evolve over time under that scenario. So once you're done with selecting the scenario, you can see a time series plot that shows how this proportion of species at risk of local extension will evolve till 2100. Including a confidence interval derived from our modeling simulation. The line in the middle is color-coded so that you can see when global warming levels of 1.5 to as well as 2.5 degree Celsius are crossed. Below, you can also see a map showing how these proportions vary in space of the country for 2030, 2050, 2100. And it's also possible to compare with how these will look like for a more ambitious climate scenario by selecting, for example, the shifting pathway scenario from the list. This one is compatible with the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris by by selecting it, the time series plot and the map will adjust so that you can compare how results differ for those two scenarios, and including here. And you can also look at the difference between two scenarios. Right. But we have indicators on biodiversity. As I said, we have added information on glaciers as well. One important thing, one interesting way to look at the results, I think, and which is quite unique in the Provide Climate Risk dashboard, is that we can look at and we can answer the question, for example, what is the risk of exceeding critical impact levels in the future? And that's what this last graph is focusing on. So you can select first a level of impact here, and let's say 30% of species at risk of local extinction. And what's the risk of more than 30% of a species being at risk of local extinction in Brazil over time? And you can explore how much of that local risk is unavoidable, even in the most ambitious climate action scenario, as indicated by the dark gray columns here. And you can compare to how much of that local risk can be avoided by strengthening climate action by looking at the light gray columns here, which indicate the difference in risk between the most ambitious climate action scenario and the least ambitious one. We've also added information on impacts of urban heat on people living in cities, and which we already had indicated on that in the previous version, but now we also added information on impacts on people, such as, for example, population exposed to heat waves, which you can access here. And one functionality also is that there's now the possibility to overlay this information on a satellite view, which allows you basically to relate how differences in urban heat across the area across Mexico City actually depend on the density basically of the build-up area, or whether you located in, for example, rural areas. So now in the dashboard, we also offer another perspective on impact projections, which is available on the user mode called Avoiding Future Impacts. That's basically following up on this idea of reversing the impact chain that Carl was presenting just before. This user mode is called Avoiding Future Impacts. As I said, it's available for indicators of heat stress in 140 cities. And we can, for example, try to answer the questions: what needs to happen so that we can avoid reaching undesirable levels of heat stress in my city? For example, how much climate action is required to avoid getting more than 50 heat wave days in Mexico City? So once clicking on Mexico City and selecting the indicator heat wave days per year in this user mode, you can focus on this part on the left-hand side, which tells you that on average, Mexico City experienced 15 heatwave days per year over the 2011-2020 period. And if you're interested in what needs to happen so that we don't get more than 50 days per year, let's move the slider to 50. And then we need to specify the maximum risk of crossing that level that we're willing to take, 50%, or rather a more cautious approach, and say, let's do what needs to happen so that this risk doesn't go above 5%. And you can read the answers here. It tells you that to keep the chance that the urban area of Mexico City will on average experience over 50 heatwave days per year below 5%, one should pursue global emission pathways in line with limiting global warming to 1.7 degrees. Below, you can also see the year under which this level will be crossed for the three main scenarios and that we're looking at in the dashboard. And you can also check how the results differ for various locations across the city by using this drop-down menu or looking at the map here. So basically, by offering to start from local impacts and linking those two metrics of global climate action, such as global warming levels or global emission scenarios, we're hoping that this user mode would be of particular interest to stakeholders focusing on urban climate adaptation, such as urban planners or policymakers at a city level. Now what's new as well is in the climate risk dashboard that we don't only provide dry information on future climate impacts, but we also give guidance on how to use it for adaptation planning. And that's available in this adaptation module here. And on the main page of this module, you will find general guidance on adaptation planning, reflecting provide research results, So information on how to use dashboard data in adaptation planning. Possibility to download also as a PDF what we call overshoot proofing self-assessment tool, which allows to check that adaptation policies account for concepts such as limits of adaptation, so the points after which adaptation measures no longer function, or reversibility versus irreversibility of impacts. And this is something that Carl was mentioning before. We're also emphasizing on the ability, the possibility to integrate limits in long-term adaptation planning. And you recognize here the graphs that help think about that concept that Carl already presented earlier. Now, we do not only provide some general guidance, but we actually also provide examples of how can local stakeholder engagement and modeling activities be used to identify and assess adaptation options. This was actually done in case studies run under the Provide project, for example, in Lisbon, in Nassau in the Bahamas, or in Islamabad. And we've tried to summarize this information in stories that are available here. And we can focus, for example, on the one for Islamabad, because this is where my co-panelist today, Dr. Mariam Saleh-Khan, was conducting the stakeholder engagement activities, and where you can find the results of these activities very much summarized to something that is digestible for and adapted to this format, but basically some information on the current context, the current risks and posed by climate change already now in Islamabad, but also other socioeconomic challenges such as urban growth and specific vulnerabilities experienced by the people there. And then we can actually browse through and play with different projections for a climate risk dashboard, which are reproduced here in a more simple way to understand what are the risks posed to Islamabad and for in the future. So to conduct the risk assessment, which is very much needed as a first step for the adaptation planning. And then once this is done, we also basically look at the adaptation options that were identified by urban planners and through stakeholder engagement activities in the city. And these were modeled, and the efficacy, the effectiveness of those were modeled across the city. And we can see the results in the last part of this story. Basically, for example, here, comparing what would happen in 2100 in a specific sector of Islamabad under the current land use map, and if adaptation measures such as tree plantation, but also restoration of streams to protect from floods, and also addition of buildings to provide shade would be implemented. That's what you can see by checking the adaptation map here, and you can also zoom on specific location that illustrate how temperature would decrease, for example, where trees are added. So that was it for my presentation of the new additions to the Provide Climate Risk Dashboard. And I will now hand over to Mariam to explain how the stakeholder engagement activities were conducted as part of the project to actually lead to these results. Thanks a lot.
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much, Quentin, for this detailed walkthrough of the dashboard. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Mariam Saleh-Khan from Weather and Climate Services, Pakistan. So continuing from the adaptation story of Islamabad that Quentin just presented, I will quickly go through our background work in engaging with the local stakeholders of the iconic regions and cities to assess local adaptation challenges. I will be focusing mainly on the test case of Upper Indus Basin and the city of Islamabad. In this project, actually, we selected 4 iconic regions because of their diverse climatic settings and one iconic city from each of the regions to study impacts of overshoot climate on the urban scale. So as you can see here in the slide, that there were the regions selected were from Arctic region, and the city of Bodo was selected from Norway. Then the second iconic region was Iberian Mediterranean, and the Lisbon city was one of the iconic cities. For Upper Indus Basin, we selected the city of Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan, and then from the Caribbean small islands, Nassau was the city which was the iconic city in our project to study the impacts of overshoot on the urban scale. Next slide, please. Next slide. As Quentin just presented the adaptation story, we actually divided this task, this whole process into 3 tasks. So the first task was actually the stock taking of the regional and local climate risk and adaptation challenges, for which we reviewed the climate adaptation challenges in Islamabad, because I'm focusing on the city of Islamabad. It was done for the other iconic cities as well. So we began by conducting a thorough examination of the available scientific and grey literature in the Upper Indus Basin and the city of Islamabad. This review also provided us key insights in the region's climate dynamics and historical impacts. After that, we assessed the spatial structure profile and urban strategic structure of the Islamabad. This analysis was really crucial in understanding the city's vulnerability to these climatic events based on its geographic and infrastructure characteristics. And this map that you see is not from any literature and was actually created by our partners at BUR. Sorry, am I audible and visible? I see some.
Yes, we can hear and see you.
Thank you. So this was actually created by our partners at BUR, as you can see here on the right side. So to complement this research, we engaged with local stakeholders to identify the most threatening climatic hazard and at-risk economic sectors in Islamabad. So these engagements also highlighted significant issues such as heat stress and urban flooding in the city. These engagements were very important because we gathered valuable insights from a diverse group of stakeholders, including government officials, private sector, academia, researchers, and NGOs. This collaborative approach actually ensured that our findings and recommendations, which we planned in the next step, were well informed and tailored to the local context. Next slide, please. Okay, in the next step, which is defined here as the task 2, it was targeted to identification and assessment of the key risks in the city, a threshold and potential responses to overshoot pathways, which were developed during this project. So for each of the iconic cities, we conducted high-resolution modeling, which was actually done by one of our partners at BUR at 1 meter scale. And for Islamabad, it was mainly focused on heat stress. So this detailed analysis was very crucial to understand the specific impacts of heat stress on the urban areas, like for Islamabad and Lisbon. And there were other impacts that were studied for Nassau and Bodo. So for this process, we again arranged multiple stakeholder engagement activities to discuss various overshoot scenarios and their probable future impacts. So these discussions were very essential to explore the adaptation options so that these are tailored for the local context, as I mentioned earlier as well. With that, we also applied an overshoot proofing methodology that was developed by our partners in this project to existing policies, plans, and projects already in the region and the city. So this application of this methodology actually assessed whether the current and future initiatives that are taken for the adaptation measures are resilient and capable of addressing the challenges posed by climate change, specifically under the overshoot scenarios that were developed during this project. So next slide, please. Then we moved on to the next task in this process, which was actually the practical application of this provide overshoot proofing methodology. So our partners from SWECO then developed and designed various adaptation options, integrating them into the spatial profiles that I just shared earlier. And you can see here the slider map this Quentin just already showed from the dashboard. So these adaptation options were integrated into the spatial profiles and maps to address the climate change challenges effectively in future. These adaptation options were various, like they varied in approach from very intense to the mild ones, because mainly we focus on the nature-based solutions for the adaptation measures. Some were highly regular, such as proposing some of the building demolitions in areas of very high heat intensity and heat stress, and some other was very more conveniently applicable, for example, plantation of trees. And these are very helpful in reducing some of the very high heat stress impacts to the higher impacts or mild impacts. But of course, considering the severe impacts of heat stress in the city, we still need to advance these options further. So we modeled these changes in hazard projections considering the proposed adaptation scenarios to ensure their effectiveness. Trees have been identified as the most effective way of reducing heat stress so far as per the model. Additionally, a combination of trees and high buildings, the shades of those buildings provided the optimal setup for mitigation of the heat stress. Next slide, please. Next slide. Hello. Okay, thank you. So as you can see here, throughout the duration of the project, we conducted multiple stakeholder meetings periodically, as you can see from the dates here on the slide. One at the very beginning of the project to stocktake of the challenges and the adaptive capacity of the region and the city. So these meetings also include a diverse group of participants, such as government officials, as I mentioned earlier, adaptation practitioners, representatives from development partners, then some of the international organizations involved in the adaptation projects, which are already ongoing on ground, then some research institutes, think tanks, academicians, private sector, and NGOs. So we had a very diverse group of stakeholders involved in this discussion. So these engagements, stakeholders actually identified recurrent climate risk in the upper Indus Basin, for example, flooding in Gulfs, and in Islamabad, the heat stress, urban heat island effect, and urban flooding, which recently posed a very severe impact, which resulted in few deaths recently in 2021. So although as per the application of the overshoot proofing methodology, as you can see in our last stakeholder engagement meeting, it showed that existing policy recognized climate change as a significant threat, and but they are currently limited in exploring the projected intensity of various hazards, and it really needs to enhance the capacity, adaptive capacity of the local at the local level. Sector-wide adaptation and implementations are still in the nascent phase, as we figured out through these stakeholder engagements. But we just came to know that in 2023, very first national adaptation plan of the country was released. So it was important to overshoot proof that, which we also did during these stakeholder engagements. So besides that, knowledge regarding overshoot scenarios was initially limited among stakeholders. However, once explained during the meetings, they effectively grasped the concept and applied the overshoot proofing methodology to existing policies, plans, and projects. Another important factor that I would like to highlight was the data constraint, particularly regarding the land use and land change, plus the socioeconomic aspect, which further hindered the effective research adaptation planning. So the need for capacity building in research-informed adaptation planning was a recurring theme in our interactions during these stakeholder engagements. So nonetheless, the stakeholder engagement highlighted, as I mentioned, several critical points. For example, the vulnerability of exposed population also was discussed, socioeconomic limitations to adaptations, then the lack of consideration of warming scenarios in most of the policies for relevant for the climate change, and the need to assess limits to adaptation, which are currently not there in those policies. And of course, the low financial capacity of the country, lack of usable data, and research to drive policy is also one of the very important points that was discussed during these engagements. So all these engagements with stakeholders really informed us to give the background and the local context for development of this dashboard that Quentin just presented before me. And it is built up on all this knowledge that was collected at 4 iconic regions. So I stop here and you can hand over to Asha, I guess.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mariam. Oh, well, I mean, thank you to everybody who has just spoken. So could I ask everyone on the panel to maybe put your cameras back on, because we're going to move into a bit of a discussion now. We have about 25 minutes left on this call. And so first, I would like to go to Pam Pearson, who is the director of the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative. And so hopefully has a lot of interest in the new glacier data that's been added to the database. But maybe you could introduce yourself, tell us a bit about your work, and tell us maybe how this could be useful for you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And ICCI serves as also the Secretariat of the Ambition on Melting Ice High-Level Group. And that is a gathering of countries that are really concerned about the connection of cryosphere science and the implications of cryosphere science for policy. So that's our main focus. What is the impact of cryosphere loss and change on ambition, mitigation, adaptation, and ultimately loss and damage? And this dashboard is an incredibly useful tool. I would encourage those who are attending this webinar to really explore it, because it has a great deal of depth and usefulness in all sorts of levels. Our sense is that as people, both policymakers, but also the general public, can really see the reality of these changes, in particular overshoot, the idea is to aim for greater mitigation to avoid a lot of those impacts, but prepare for adaptation needs in a very realistic way, and be aware then that there comes a point where we hit limits of adaptation, say because of glacier loss, where we're moving into regions of loss and damage. And ultimately, many policymakers in the climate space are talking about loss of existence. In other words, the need to move. And as one example for glaciers, then, they have huge and essentially irreversible responses to overshoot. So you can think about glaciers as well as ice sheets and resulting sea level rise. The way they react is almost set by peak temperature. And so coming back down again in an overshoot scenario doesn't necessarily get you back to where you were before. It probably does not. These respond very slowly, but very inexorably to what the peak temperature is going to be. And glaciers, as well as ice sheets, are important in terms of water resources. Glaciers are iconic in a lot of these countries. They have very symbolic value, but in addition to that, glaciers and snow together, you can think of glaciers almost as a proxy for snow, have real impacts on water resources downstream, whether it's for irrigation or power. And just as one example, coming up later this year, the COP will take place in Baku in Azerbaijan. Baku is reliant, about 26% of its water resources on an annualized basis comes from glaciers or snow. That's a huge amount if you take it on an annualized basis. It means, in other words, that in the dry season, say July, August, September, Baku is almost entirely reliant on what is coming off of those mountains that were stored the previous winter in the form of glacier ice or annual snowpack. So because glaciers really respond to these peak temperatures, as Carl was saying, policymakers need to understand that overshoot is not another way of achieving the same climate goal. If you overshoot and come back down, that's very different from staying at a certain temperature level. So the cryosphere glaciers respond in a different manner. That needs to be taken into account in policymaking, and this climate risk dashboard really makes that clear to policymakers that overshoot is important and you need to be planning for the worst, but really working to avoid that worst through mitigation. And that's really what this can bring to the policy debate. So really appreciate the chance to speak to this. And again, I'd encourage people to explore the dashboard.
Thank you so much, Pam. I'm really glad that a lot of you actually have mentioned this overshoot point. And I thought it was very interesting, Marianne, mentioning that stakeholders maybe don't always understand this point initially. It's definitely a question that I wanted to ask if we didn't get to it. And so I'm very glad you have, because I see we have a lot of questions to get through in the next 20 minutes. So on that note, please do keep sending in your questions. We've already got a few. I'm going to try and get through as many as we can, but we also have our brilliant panelists answering some of the questions in the chat as well. So take a look there. But before we move into the open panel discussion section, I want to introduce David Carlin, who is a program lead with the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure at UNEP. And so it would be just great to get your reactions to everything we've heard so far, your thoughts on how this tool, how this data could be used in your sector.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Aisha, and also big congratulations to the research team for putting this together. I know it's been a lot of work. I've been fortunate to be part of that journey as a member of the advisory board. And what I would say is when we began this journey, when Carl had approached me a couple of years ago and was talking about getting funding for the project and applications, we kicked around a few different points about how these things could be used for financial decision makers and other allocators of capital. And I think one of the big things that really comes through is, one, that the financial sector really needs to understand the science and the implications of that science a lot better. And I think that this is very much coming on the heels of some of the warmest months on record, and a lot of people who've been looking in the financial sector at the rate of emissions and seeing them not falling are beginning to kind of grumble. Does this mean 1.5 is dead? Should we give up on 1.5? And I think that that message is absolutely the wrong message, and it's why it's so critical, one, to explain the importance of the science behind not only limiting warming as much as we can, but also retreating to that level of safety as soon as possible. There's even a number of studies coming out that will look at whether 1.5 itself may be too high on that planetary thermostat, that there are many processes that have been set in motion and may continue to accelerate if we maintain elevated temperatures. So I think that this tool really does capture that well by bringing home the point that this isn't a moving goalpost, in the sense that once we fail at one, well, we'll back it up. It's that intense and rapid and coordinated mitigation is urgent. It's not just a policy priority, which I think it's increasingly becoming, but it is a scientific and perhaps it's not so far to say a societally existential point as well, that this really needs to be understood and appreciated. I think the other part, though, from the financial user base is getting down to details. One of the things that, and I've worked with the Glasgow Financial Alliances for Net Zero. I'm the founder of UNEP's Risk Center. The Finance Initiative launched its Risk Center earlier this year, working on a variety of different environmental risks and how finance both contributes to those, but also can begin to think about managing and helping to solve those. And across all of that work and all those convenings, we've really struggled with the idea of getting granular enough to use the information for decision making. This sort of so what? There's more data than ever before. There's fundamentally new and exciting methods, whether through AI, through machine learning, new observation systems, LiDAR, and other satellite technologies. And yet the point is, all of this isn't going to drive change unless it gets used in decision making. And I think one thing that's really been powerful in climate and the work, previously that Carl had been doing with Climate Interactive, and I see many of the same cast members, of course, here, is to really bring this down to a decision useful level, to ask these questions. And when I talk about scenarios with financial actors, I really try to talk about the exploratory scenarios as well as the normative scenarios. What could the future be versus what future do we want? And while we can think of those as two similar areas, we can also think of them as parallel in the sense that one is about how bad do things get and what are the consequences as that happens. It's a bit of an open-ended exercise. But the other is to say, if we want to avoid certain effects, how do we bend that curve down and how much bending do we need? And this actually very much parallels the work in the financial sector of stress testing, the idea of having a stress test to see whether firms are ready, but also the reverse stress test, which is lesser known but equally useful, which is at what level do things begin to break down? And I think with the climate impacts and the avoiding climate impacts, the tool does a really brilliant job of answering both of those questions. And so one of my big missions over the months ahead is to be working with the team on how do we bring this to more financial actors? How do we get more people using this, getting involved, and really beginning to inform decisions? Because I think it is now at the right level of accessibility, of granularity. And to me, it's just up to now leaders within organizations to take the decisions that are increasingly staring them in the face.
Thanks, David. It's really good to see that this tool is actually reaching the people who it needs to get to. I think sometimes people have the idea that science can be quite insular, and so it's great to see events like this where we have such a range of people coming together to actually talk about practical steps. And I have a lot of questions on that, but I'm aware we only have 15 minutes and we also have a lot of audience questions. And you've got to give the people what they want. So we're going to start with one of the audience questions we got in, which is about tipping points. Does this tool consider tipping points? And I think if it's okay, I'm going to throw this question to Carl to start with.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's an excellent question, and it points to also all the other research that we have been doing under the Provide project. And I am happy to say that to give you a little bit of a sneak peek of something that might come in a few weeks down the road as a high level publication on the implications of overshoot for tipping risks, in particular of the Greenland and Western Arctic ice sheet, but also the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation and the Amazonian rainforest. And what we do find is that indeed limiting peak warming, so every 10th of a degree above 1.5, is increasing the risks of crossing one of these tipping points. But in the very long run, bringing temperatures back down again. And also, I believe Pam has highlighted this, well below 1.5 in the very long run, probably going back down to 1 degree or even lower, will effectively, in the very long run, limit the risks of triggering some of these tipping points, because it is a big uncertainty that we have in this discussion currently, that we do not really know how fast the system's going to respond to the warming that we and the climate stresses that we put on them. And we need to consider a broad range of different outcomes. And this is exactly one of the other branches of the research that we've been exploring under the project. Not all of these impacts find their way into the tool, because not all of them are directly kind of digestible or relevant in the context of informing direct decision making on the ground. They are more linked to the questions of fundamental research, as in this case, for example, we are looking into these risks of tipping points. But I want to stress that we are also still in the process of adding other indicators. So we are also exploring questions like peatland loss and permafrost loss, but also exploring still the projections for global sea level rise under the different Provide scenarios. And if we still manage to add these going forward over the coming month, we will have some of these emerging signs that we have of, or the impact of overshoot on different tipping points also being reflected in the dashboard.
Thanks, brilliant answer. So I'm going to go to another question, which was actually, I think, by the same person, Tim. Thank you, Tim. Does the tool consider the risk of lethal humidity to humans? Maybe Quentin can answer that one.
Sure, happy to do that. Yeah, thanks, Tim, for the question. You're pointing at an important point, which is, like, it's not only about temperature, but also about humidity. We know there are certain areas in the world where it's very hot, but it's maybe less hot than in like around, I'm thinking about the Persian Gulf, but it's maybe less hot than in the middle of a desert. And sometimes, but the problem is that it's actually also very humid. And there are projections saying that, these areas may become inhabitable in the future because of this combination of high temperature and also high humidity level which basically prevent our body to from properly regulating its own temperature through transpiration. So this is very important to take into account humidity when looking at impacts of heat stress, not only at temperature. So that's actually what the modelers that we've worked with under the project have done. So the projections of urban heat stress that you can access on the tool have taken into account this combination of temperature and humidity level, and so projections of future humidity as well. But not only, also when you look at very detailed maps of Islamabad and the story at 1 meter resolution under current conditions, but also in the future, you can also see the variations in space depending on whether you would be located, and you look at the location which is open, with direct solar radiation, or whether it's located within the shade provided by buildings or trees, and you can see that that makes a difference. So we also took into account solar radiation and also wind speed, actually, and this is encapsulated in this metric, which is called Weber glow temperature, which also defines specific levels of heat stress that you can find in the dashboard. We provide information on days with moderate stress, with high stress, very high, or extreme, and this is all based on these different levels of Weber glow temperature. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And I am now going to sneak in one of those questions that I had, even though I see there are lots of more audience questions left, which is more about the on-the-ground practical side. So what kind of real-world challenges do adaptation practitioners face? And can tools like this actually help them in their work? So I'm going to open this up to either David or Pam or Mariam. Yeah.
I'll address briefly first. I would say that there's a huge challenge because the amount of adaptation you have to plan is very closely tied to the amount of mitigation that you're going to do. There are certain things built in. If you're looking very, shortly out, 10 years, even 20 years, that doesn't really change by emissions pathway. But, my goodness, once you start getting 30, 40, 50 years out, if you're building infrastructure that's meant to last for 100 years, it's really important to know whether you're going to be dealing with 50 centimeters of sea level rise, or in a very extreme scenario, 3 meters of sea level rise. So that's a huge challenge for adaptation experts at this time. How much do they need to adapt? And where do they need to actually plan for retreat, in essence? And so that's a really key issue that this dashboard can help answer.
Brilliant, thank you. Mariam, David, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Yes, I would like to add from the perspective of developing countries, because for them, lack of resources is the very biggest challenge, I guess, for adaptation planning. And the second very big challenge is the lack of knowledge and available data for effective planning. So Provide is one of the projects that filled some of the gap in the knowledge sector. But for the economic sector, we should go to the climate finance, which is these days a very hot debate.
Yeah, I would say that, the piece that comes up time and again is the fact that we talk about our needs on a planetary basis, but those needs really are different and differentiated on a local basis. And so we can talk about, it's easier almost to say, we need this many trillions of dollars, or we need to reduce emissions by this amount. But when it comes to the actual practicalities, getting to where the needs are, we see that the financing is really just a trickle of what is required. And so we don't want to be distracted by the big numbers that are mentioned, or by the discussions of global priorities, when even though climate is a global phenomena, the effects really are local. And I think that when we don't think about that, we have these sort of circular discussions in the climate finance community about mobilizing capital. Okay, but what does that mean in practice, or in terms of the financing gap? But who's filling that gap? Where is that gap most acute? Where are the potential life-saving interventions in the case of resiliency and adaptation that need to be made? where are commitments for choosing a different course rather than just debating who has the right to the remaining carbon budget. And so to me, it's actually one of those problems that from a distance looks simpler, and from the zoom in really gets down to the operational conditions in each place and the fact that we're not succeeding on our financing goals. And if we don't do that, it's going to create a toll, not just in terms of warming, but also, of course, in terms of lives and livelihoods.
Absolutely. And I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions if we're quick. So a question for those same 3 people, David, Miriam, and Pam, not necessarily all of you, but should we be more worried about the high risk climate outcomes? I mean, I know Pam was talking about sort of the limits of adaptation being reached in some cases. Is that something that we should be concerned about more, that we're not focusing on enough at the moment, in your opinion?
I mean, I certainly think so, because the implications are just so huge, especially for developing countries. A country like Pakistan is getting it at both ends, from loss of water resources and flooding to sea level rise. And if we continue on our current pathway, those high risk scenarios become very, very real. Also, urban planners especially, they're used to looking at these extremes, right? They're planning for the 1 in 100 year events. And being able to look at those, say, through the dashboard, makes it also very clear that the much less amount of money, and this goes to many of David's points, that would be necessary to mitigate rather than adapt, let alone provide loss and damage funding.
Yeah, so one thing that I would just say is that it's critical to think about the tail risks. There's been so much great work that's been done recently on this, from Helen Avery, from Nicola Ranger, from a number of different sources that are really talking about the tail risk. But to me, it's actually a lot more intuitive than the science, which is, you think about life insurance or you think about home insurance, you buy it not for the average occurrence, but for the extreme occurrence. Right now, the equivalent of what we're doing is, rather than saving for retirement, being responsible and having a insurance policy, is we're kind of playing the lottery here. We're saying, hopefully we'll win the millions and then we'll be able to, get off scot-free. And so the point is not about the average outcome here. We're very willing to take protection against highly undesirable outcomes. And to me, this is the king of highly undesirable outcomes. And so it makes sense. And I think sometimes we have these quibbles about percentages and what if there's a 10% chance versus a 5. And I think that's academic, because it's the same point as, well, sure, in a country like the US, sure, if you go without health insurance, well, yeah, the risk in a given year, in a given period, may be low-ish, but the consequence is devastating. And we should really appreciate that risk is composed both of likelihood, but also of impact. And I think if we're forgetting that, we leave ourselves really dangerously exposed.
I would also like to, again, speak from the local regional perspective. As Pakistan is one of the hottest places now, as Quentin just mentioned, that wet bulb temperature recorded in some of the stations already surpassed human survivability multiple times in this region, and at even current global warming levels. So anything beyond 1.5 degree would be kind of a death sentence for this. So there are for this region. So there are limits to adaptation. We can't just focus or rely on the adaptation. Again, it all goes to the mitigation measures, as Pam mentioned.
Absolutely. So I am aware that we are at time, but I'm just going to ask one last quick question, because I want to know, maybe from Carl and Quentin, what's next? What would you add to this database if you could? Can you reveal any plans about what's coming? We've just got these 4 new indicators, so I imagine that you guys are constantly working on new things. I'm curious to hear about the next steps.
Yeah, I can the start, and thank you very much for the question and for sharing your excitement. We are definitely very excited also to continue to work on that dashboard. As I said, there's some more work ongoing under the project, and more indicators are going to be added over time. So watch that space. That's still active development. But probably even more importantly, we are obviously very keen for the dashboard to extend well beyond what the current project's lifetime is, which is, as those of you familiar with how the science funding landscape works, limited in time and ends this year. But we have a very high commitment from everyone involved to continue to update and maintain that tool and also extend it. So we had an excellent question, for example, earlier from a colleague from Afghanistan wondering why no cities in Afghanistan were covered. And similarly, if you look at the dashboard and you miss your city, you miss your region, you miss an indicator that you're particularly interested in, reach out to us. Also, in terms of looking at the case studies and some of the applied work that we've done, the adaptation storyline development, this is really some level of prototyping that we are doing that can be extended and applied in other regions. We very much see this as a hub that can grow going forward. So please also share with us your needs as well as your ideas on how to further extend that. And also reach out to us if you and to show us your use cases. Share the way you're using the dashboard if you happen to do so. Take us on social media if you have that, and if you feel now you walk away from this workshop and it's like, oh, I have all these colleagues and we would really love them to see and explore this, and we have these detailed questions because it's relevant for one specific application. Don't hesitate to reach out to us as well. We are very keen to make that work for you, and also looking forward to provide necessary adjustments and updates going forward.
Brilliant. Content, anything you want to add, or are we good?
Yeah, I think we're good. In the interest of time, I'll just say stay tuned, and yeah, thanks everyone.
All right, brilliant. So
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you so much to all our panelists. So to David, Quentin, Carl, Pam, and Mariam. Thank you to all of you who've come and watched the webinar. And most importantly, thank you to the team who have developed the database. I think we can all agree the interface is fantastic and the science is there. So next steps, please go forth and spread this fantastic resource with all the people who you think need to know about it. So thank you, everyone.